Doctor, can you help him? The question cut through the low hum of the hospital lobby like a single bell. It was not a plea from a stranger at a distance. It was raw, close, articulate, and broken at the same time. A man in a thin coat knelt on the linoleum, his hands gripping a small, shivering boy. Rain darkened his hair, and on the inside of his left wrist, a faded scar traced like a memory. A photograph, folded and worn at the edges, peeped from the pocket of his jacket. A woman with a wide, patient smile and an apron dusted with flour. On the back, in a careful looping hand, someone had written, "Sarah, my light." Around them, people looked up from phones and magazines. The automatic doors sighed open and closed. Someone cleared their throat. A nurse moved between the rows of chairs with a clipboard, eyes already elsewhere. The doctor, tall, tired, hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic, paused mid-step. He had seen need before. He had also seen limits. Outside, under the hospital's sodium lights, a car idled. Black shoes stepped from the pavement onto the wet concrete. Elliot Carrington, who wore success the way most people wore coats, stood watching. He had not meant to see the scene. He had come to the hospital to sign papers, to host a charity reception upstairs. He had arrived too early because he liked the solitude of waiting rooms at night. Now his polished shoes were reflected in a puddle, and the reflection trembled with the boy's small, hungry mouth. Michael Hayes kept looking at the child, Sam, more out of habit than calculation. Sam had been asleep when they'd left the shelter, curled beneath blankets like a small animal needing warmth. Now his lashes were wet with sleep and hunger, and Michael felt every minute of every hard night in the line around his mouth. He had been taught not to ask for help with a fierceness that had no place for pride, but when a child is small and raw, the rules change. "Doctor," he said again, low and urgent. "He hasn't eaten today. He's been spitting up. He's running a fever. I don't know where to go." The doctor's hands rose, palms open, procedural softness, the kind you use to avoid making promises. "We have a pediatrician on call in the ER, he said. "We can look him over for sure. There's also the clinic across the street that does walk-ins." "No insurance," Michael interrupted, voice catching on the fact. "No ID, no home." He looked at the boy, then at the floor, as if the tiles might somehow roll up and show a safe place beneath. "I'm trying. I'm doing what I can. Someone was moving toward them then, a man with grease under his nails and an oil-smudged jacket rolled up at the sleeves. He moved like he belonged to the streetlights, the kind of steady gait that comes from years of hands that know tools, not from polite boardroom training. He set down a battered canvas bag on the floor and pulled out a small thermos and a wrapped sandwich. He did not ask permission. He did not make a big show of it. He knelt and set a paper cup between Michael's hands, and, like it was the simplest thing in the world, he said, "Sit. Eat." The man's name was Jack Rowan. He had been lingering at the diner next door, a familiar fixture to the woman behind the counter who knew everyone's order and forgot no one's name. He had seen the father arrive and seen the plea, and he had come because he'd been on the receiving end of a stranger's goodwill once, because someone had pulled a chair for him when he needed it most, years ago, and it had felt like the universe had recognized his right to a meal and to a voice. Jack's gesture was quiet. He ordered 2 bowls of soup and an extra coffee. He pulled out a chair, old, scraped, but whole, and offered it to Michael without ceremony. Michael hesitated for a heartbeat, an old pride flaring like a bruise, then sat. The chair was warm from the diner's lamp, and it folded itself into the story as if it had been waiting for this moment. The doctor softened, made a phone call to a social worker, and the nurse took Sam into a small room to check his fever. Elliot watched from where he stood, then moved closer, not into their circle but to the diner window that framed the scene in chrome and neon. The window held their reflections like a picture. A child dipping a spoon into soup, a man with a photograph in his pocket, the outline of a stranger who had simply brought a chair, and the soft sound of people reclaiming a small dignity. Elliot had wealth, and he had been taught that wealth often required discretion. He had also been taught never to stand idly by when it was clear he could help. He saw everything, because sometimes seeing is the first step toward doing. If this moves you, share this story with someone who needs help. Jack did not ask Michael to tell his story that night. He didn't want the man to empty his grief like a cup to be judged. But when the nurse came out and said Sam's fever was low enough, Jack led them into the diner and ordered bowls big enough for 2. The diner smelled of onion and butter and coffee, everything warm that the rain outside was not. In that glow, Michael unfolded the edges of what he would say. "I used to make bread," he told Jack, voice low, "before Sarah fell sick. I worked with her at the bakery on 3rd. That smell you get, dough and yeast, that's my anchor. Then she got better for a while, and then worse, and then we lost everything. I've been trying to keep Sam out of shelters that are full. I got a job interview once, but without a permanent address, they wouldn't take me. 3rd Street Bakery, the night cook said from behind the counter, and something in Michael's shoulders relaxed. Names are small miracles. They make a world feel connected. The cook, Marcus, had been the one to cut cake for neighborhood birthdays for as long as anyone could remember. He had 2 flour-smudged rings on his fingers and eyes like a man who had stayed up too late, cutting corners and making sure pastry lined up in neat, hopeful rows in the morning. He listened in silence and then said, "Tell me the time you worked there. Tell me what you made." Michael talked about baguettes with airy crumb and a habit of burning his knuckles first thing, how the oven burns becomes something like prayer. He showed the photograph of Sarah on his phone, thumb tracing her smile as if the motion could smooth the past. Jack watched him tell it and watched the boy pick at the edge of the paper cup, and something like a plan settled in Jack's face. Across the street, Elliot stepped into the night and made a call. He did not announce his move. He only asked questions. Who owned the old bakery on Maple? Which landlords were sympathetic to short-term housing? If there were programs that could pay a deposit for a first month? He asked each question with the same careful economy he used for his business. He knew money could pay for many things, but money was often slowed by forms and human shame. Elliot also knew how to open doors. He could make people return calls when they would ignore a stranger in a coat. It began the kind of way change often begins, quietly, and with a refusal to accept the available options as final. 2 days later, there was a small stack of charity vouchers, a bus pass, and a note from the clinic promising Sam a checkup next week. Marcus offered Michael a morning shift to test him out. 3 hours of dough and the chance to prove that hands could make a living and not just survive. Jack lent him a set of clean work pants. Elliot arranged for the landlord of a vacant efficiency above a closed shop to consider a short-term reduced rate while Michael got on his feet. Nothing miraculous happened. The world still had its cold corners, but pieces began to move in the right direction. What everyone who passed Michael on the sidewalk did not see on that first night were the decisions he made in the small hours. He had been given a thermos of soup and an offer. He had been looked at without disgust. That did not erase the nights he hadn't slept, the hours spent trying to calculate a rent he could not afford. It did not heal the bone-deep loss of Sarah. But when he walked toward Marcus's bakery on his first day with his hands smelling like detergent, he carried one small thing: the memory of someone pulling out a chair for him. He promised himself he would pull out that same chair for someone else when he could. Promise is a kind of currency. The first week at the bakery was a test of muscle memory and hope. Michael woke before dawn and found that the practice of getting to work was a kind of prayer, kneading until the dough obeyed, eyes toward the clock sweeping like a hymn. Sam spent mornings with a neighbor who ran a small day program out of the community center, the cost quietly covered by a donation Elliot had made through a friend of a friend who liked to keep his name off lists. The social worker met Michael once a week to help fill out forms and to track progress without judgment. Marcus mentored him like a teacher who'd once learned to trust people again. He showed Michael how to read an oven like a friend reads a face. The Millionaire's intervention, as it unfolded, was careful. Elliot never barged into the bakery swinging a check. He did not stage a news conference or insist on a photo op. He met Michael once, awkwardly, in the corner of the bakery one slow Tuesday when the rain pined at the windows. He sat at a mismatched table, ordered a coffee he sipped without savoring, and then said, "I saw you at the hospital." Michael's first instinct was to shrink away from gratitude like a man wary of transactions. "You didn't have to," he said. Elliot's laugh was small. "I know, neither did you." Then he explained what he could do without making promises. He would make introductions, press a few favors, sponsor a community baking course that could create jobs, and help secure a deposit so Michael could sleep in a place that didn't feel temporary. He made it clear he expected no gratitude framed as obligation. He wanted a partnership, small, precise, and respectful. He told Michael there were systems for helping people start again, but systems required someone willing to enter them. "You can do the baking," he said. "I'll try to move the red tape." There was a point along this path where gossip began to thread through the neighborhood like a stubborn vine. People noticed the shiny shoes in the bakery doorway. They saw a man in a suit at a table where a week before only flour dust and laughter had been. Some called it charity, some called it charity theater. Others, more blunt, wondered aloud whether Michael had slipped through the cracks of justice and into a quick handout. And Michael, who carried both pride and a recent history of compromise, felt the tug of those voices. He worried he would be known as the man who had been helped rather than the man who had helped himself. He had watched his wife, in grief, say no to too many offers because she feared the loss of dignity more than the loss of heat. On a Wednesday afternoon, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who ran the seat of the neighborhood choir and believed in practical religion more than sermons, came into the bakery. She had heard rumors and walked in with a smile and an old knitting basket. "You're Michael, aren't you?" she said, probing with kindness. "I used to bring pies to a girl named Sarah. She had a laugh like bells. She saved me a loaf when I was sick. I don't know how you knew to ask for help, but I know the woman in your photo." Michael blinked at the recognition.
The world he lived in had once been a web of small favors. Grief had severed many threads. Mrs. Patterson's memory knotted the web back a little. People began to come by the bakery, not just for croissants, but for conversation. Someone left a small jar of hand cream by the register. A teenager, encouraged by Jack, offered to sweep floors for a week in exchange for learning to make scones. The doctor from the hospital stopped in after hours with a thermos for sick neonates. The community took the shape of a family, choosing one another. But the critical turn, the kind that shifts a life into a different orbit, did not come from a single check or a single volunteer. It came from the chain. The idea that a chair can be pulled out, and then another chair follows, and another, until the room is full. Elliot's call to the landlord meant Michael could move into a tiny apartment with a window. A small grant allowed Marcus to expand morning hours and hire Michael as a lead baker. A program funded by a local nonprofit, which Elliot quietly introduced to the bakery, offered microloans to people wanting to start a food cart. Michael signed papers with a pen that felt heavier than he expected. The landlord handed him a ring of brass keys, and the weight of those keys felt like both an obligation and an anchor. Not everything was smooth. Pride, old habits, and the sheer bureaucratic slowness of aid programs made every step feel like wading through molasses. Michael nearly gave up on the microloan once the forms demanded collateral he did not have. He had to explain more than once why his past did not disqualify him from the future. The lack of a perfect safety net showed its teeth in the smaller things. A night when Sam caught a cold and the clinic was 2 neighborhoods away. A week when Marcus's oven broke and there were no spare funds to fix it immediately. On that hard afternoon, Jack, who had been present throughout, hitched together what he could. He wrote a list of small tasks and recruited others. Mrs. Kim from the corner store put together care packages. The choir donated a small fund raised at a bake sale, and Elliot called a contractor friend who waived a fee to fix the oven. The money never had the sensation of falling from the sky. It arrived with hands attached and names attached and accountability. That was the point. The Millionaire's resources were useful because they were connected to people who would shoulder the work and the responsibility. There was one line Michael refused to cross. He refused to let anyone turn his story into a sermon. "I didn't want pity," he told Jack quietly while sweeping the night shift flour off a corner shelf. "I wanted chances." Jack nodded. He understood too well. A chance is a small, human thing. A chair drawn closer, a boss who remembers your name, a child that knows what a bed that is only theirs feels like. Time, in its patient way, makes the truest test. Months passed. Sam learned the rhythms of the bakery's mornings, counting pastry cases and adorning gingerbread with sprinkles when customers weren't looking. Michael's hands grew steady again. He learned how to take feedback without folding into shame. The brass keys wound several new locks, and the photograph of Sarah was framed on a shelf between a jar of spoons and a vintage scale. Customers who had once tossed spare change into a jar now bought loaves they could pronounce. The community dinner table, once a tentative idea, became a tradition. On Saturday nights, the bakery closed early, and the tables were cleared and lined with paper, and crowded with neighbors who had once passed one another on the street without meeting each other's eyes. The chain, however, is only as strong as the people who keep it. There was a moment, sharp, when the neighborhood had to choose whether it would be part of the chain or not. A developer proposed turning the old community center into condos. The idea was wrapped in attractive renderings and wordsmithing about urban renewal. A few voices sang the siren song of quick profit. A few others muttered about taxes and better amenities. The simple idea of a space where people could gather, learn, and eat for a modest price faced the cold calculus of feasibility. It was then, in a community meeting thick with coffee and tension, that Elliot did something people could not easily place into the old scripts of rich men and rescuing angels. He did not buy them out or threaten lawsuits. He spoke for a few quiet minutes about how things had looked from the night of the hospital lobby. He spoke of being an observer who had been stirred by a small scene, and who had decided that the proper response to sight was to act in ways that widened possibility.
He also listened to the people who feared being used, to the people who wanted to be kept in the story not as recipients, but as participants. When he left, he had offered not a handout, but a structure, a fund that would buy the center's property in partnership with the local nonprofit, a plan that would preserve space for community meals and designate a percentage of work opportunities for local hires. He promised no miracles. He promised only a commitment for 5 years, contingent on measurable community involvement. When Michael heard the news, he held Sam and laughed the kind of laugh that had room to be surprised. It was not elation, it was relief laced with terror, because relief often comes before the practice of keeping a life steady. He feared the labels. He feared being a story people told over coffee as a moral anecdote. So he kept baking. He kept his head down when he could, and lifted it to say thank you when he must. He learned to accept a compliment without interpreting it as charity. He learned to ask for help with the directness he had once reserved for his son's scraped knees. The opening of the renovated center and the bakery's refurbished counter fell on a bright winter evening, when the first real cold came down and stuck to the eaves. They called it a community night and a free dinner. They hung a simple banner made by the choir. Marcus baked a display of cinnamon rolls. Michael arranged rustic loaves like small, warm promises. The table was long and scarred from years of use. Chairs lined its sides, mismatched, but all in service of the same human order. Someone sat and pulled a chair out for an elderly man. Another tucked in a little stool for a teenager who had served as a volunteer. There was a place set for anyone who needed one. Elliot arrived early, but he did not come to sit at the head of the table. He took a corner seat, sleeves rolled, a coat slung over the back of the chair. He watched as hands passed platters, and as Sam's face lit when someone complimented his newly learned skill for placing sprinkles. He heard a woman speak, voice quavering but strong, and the word she used was simple. We fed each other tonight. On the wall, between a shelf of vintage tins and a row of hooks for coats, a small framed photograph rested. It was Sarah's photograph, oft-handled, corners softened by invisible fingers. Someone had placed it there earlier, a quiet altar to a life that had been both ordinary and luminous. The brass keys that Michael had been given the first month hung on a hook beneath the photograph. He had polished them for the occasion until they gleamed. They looked both ordinary and like a trophy for endurance. There was applause, not the loud stage applause of a single savior arriving, but the clapped-together rhythm of gratitude shared across a room. People who had been strangers the year before now knew each other's children's names. The mayor gave a brief, gracious speech, and then, when the speech was done, drifted toward the food line like anyone else. Marcus stood behind the counter with flour on his hands and tears in the corners of his eyes. Michael sat across from Jack that night, 2 mugs of coffee between them, and Jack nudged over a slice of the cinnamon roll as if sharing the prize of a small victory. You did this work, Jack murmured. You climbed up, day by day. Michael shook his head. No, he said, looking at the room. 100 people did this. You pulled out the chair. Mrs. Patterson told her friend. The doctor called the clinic. Elliot paid for Sam's program. Marcus hired me. I got lucky. He smiled in a way that admitted both the luck and the labor. And some days I still get it wrong. You've done the hard part, Jack corrected gently. You kept showing up. At the end of the night, when the lights were dimmer and the chairs stood like sentinels around white tables, Elliot walked over and stood by the photograph.
He did not place anything there. He only stood, as if the small image of a woman could teach him how to stand more naturally in someone else's life, without commandeer it. Michael approached and extended his hand. Elliot took it. There were no plaques or cameras. There was only the mutual, awkward, human exchange of 2 men who had intersected because one had asked for help and because the other had, finally, chosen to move. We'll keep it running, Elliot said. I want this place to belong to you all. If you need me, call. Not to make you dependent, but to make this easier to do together. Michael's laugh was small, and it carried a generous amount of incredulity. That's the hardest part, he said, asking people to be part of the thing you hope they want to be part of. It's the most important part, Elliot answered, because if no one asks, no one knows to help. They left the bakery that night into a cold that no longer felt like an enemy, but like a backdrop. Sam clutched a small paper bag with a cookie, sugar smudged on his chin. He warmed his hands on the folded handlebars of the stroller they had borrowed while the landlord's paperwork was finished. Michael held his son's small body against his chest and felt the sound of his own heartbeat as a thing that matched the world's slow cadence. The story did not end with a miraculous cure or a one-time transformation. There were still months when the oven needed repair and when Michael's confidence wavered. There were moments when the bureaucracy pushed back and when some people in town folded their arms and scoffed at the visible involvement of a wealthy donor. There were nights when Sam woke and could not sleep, and Michael sat on the floor with him in the dim light and felt the memory of Sarah like a shadow and a warmth all at once. But over time, those nights were fewer. A rhythm established itself. Mornings of hard labor, afternoons of paperwork and new ideas, and Saturday nights when the table was full. Michael found himself teaching a class at the community center, showing young apprentices how to fold pastry and how to be patient with a sourdough starter that responds to kindness. He kept the photograph of Sarah on the shelf, polishing its frame sometimes, taking it down other times and setting it on a windowsill to catch the light. The brass keys were kept on a hook at his apartment door, where anyone who came and went could touch them and remember. Memory and participation, sharing the same hardware. There was a moment after the center had been saved and the bakery had become a small hub of instruction when a young man came to Michael's counter with eyes too old for his years. He held a small, defeated cardboard sign asking for work. Michael saw himself at that age, and he also remembered the chair. Without a speech, he slid a bowl of soup across the counter and asked the young man to come in tomorrow before dawn.
He gave him a pair of old work pants and, when the young man hesitated, offered him a chair to sit in while he ate. There is perhaps no better proof that chains become strong than when the chain's links themselves become links. The young man's gratitude was immediate and messy and human. He returned the next morning, soaked in possibility and flour. Elliot, watching from the bakery window one rainy afternoon as a new batch of apprentices took their first shaky turns at the oven, smiled. He had not become a saint in the telling of the town story. He had not wanted that, but he had discovered that wealth, kept private, is like light under a box. When it was redirected toward people who had the skills and the desire to do the work, it multiplied. Elliot stayed involved in the way of someone who loved quiet competence. He called contractors who would answer at odd hours. He made a point of listening to the people who ran programs rather than leading them. He made mistakes. He had to learn to step back sometimes and let other people own the process. But more than anything, he was a witness who had decided to let his witnessing be useful. The final image that lingered long after the story was told around other tables was not of a check being signed or of a single man standing at a microphone. It was of a long wooden table in the bakery, a child's small hand reaching for a loaf, a line of chairs pulled closely together so that no one had to eat alone. Sarah's photograph watched the room from the shelf. The brass keys on the hook glinted when the right hit them. A scar on a wrist had faded to almost a memory. People sang clumsily at a charity event, and someone started a round of applause that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with recognition. In the years that followed, the bakery became a quiet hub for second chances, a place where mothers learned to trade, where teens found a mentor, where the homeless were offered a hot meal without a line of questions. It was not a cathedral, and it did not promise absolution. It offered practical work, a table, and a place to rest. The Millionaire's name occasionally slipped into speeches, and sometimes locals rolled their eyes at the rich man who had saved the center. He did not mind that too much. He had come to understand that the important thing was not who got credit, but that the chairs stayed pulled out. One evening, long after the first night in the hospital lobby, Michael sat on the stoop with Sam asleep against his chest, the smell of yeast and sugar still clinging to his clothes. Jack joined him with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a grin. "Remember the first chair?" Jack asked. Michael closed his eyes and let the memory slide into place. It was simple and large all at once. "I do," he said. "I remember thinking I had nothing left to ask with. And then I asked." Jack nodded. "That's the part people forget. Asking isn't weakness. It's a doorway."
They sat for a while in companionable silence, and the city's lights made a loose constellation above their heads. A passerby slowed and offered directions to a lost tourist. A dog barked, distant and bright. The world did not rearrange itself into something perfect, but the edges had softened. Chairs were still pulled out every night, sometimes for the lonely, sometimes for the tired,
sometimes just for the neighbor who needed to sit and be seen. If you believe no one should eat alone, subscribe and help spread kindness.